Today for this important training. My name is David Cho, for those who don't know me, and I'm one of the elders at our church. And we do have the privilege tonight to welcome some friends from Grace. You can see the sign, Grace, to talk to us about the sensitive but really important topic on abuse in church settings and how and why we as Christians should behave. But this is not just for the church setting, but it also really is in our community that we live in. So the name Grace is an acronym that stands for Godly Responses to Abuse in Christian Environments. And Grace is a nonprofit that began 20 years ago with the purpose to empower Christian communities to recognize, prevent, and respond well to abuse. So we do have two guests from Grace tonight, and Mike Sloan and Maureen Garcia. Mike is actually, he has a master's in divinity, and he's the director of safeguarding for Grace. For the last 13 years, Mike has trained churches, schools, and other Christian ministries across the United States and abroad in abuse prevention and response best practices. Mike worked for Grace board member Victor Veith to develop the Grace seminary curriculum. So the first 3 credit-hour seminary course on child maltreatment, which was piloted at Biblical Seminary in 2017. And Mike has served as a local pastor in congregations in Atlanta, Georgia, as well as Columbus, Ohio. Our second speaker, Maureen Garcia, is our lead safeguarding specialist for Grace. She has been researching abuse dynamics at Christian environments for over 20 years, since learning that her then husband was a child sex offender. Maureen's background is in research and writing, and she taught these skills at NYC Christian College for over a decade before coming to work for Grace. Like Mike, Maureen works with churches, schools, and other ministries, providing training and support to help them create safer communities that prevent and respond well to abuse. So our speakers will be speaking in English. They will not be speaking in Korean, but for Korean translation, if you go to our website, we have actually translated all the slides that you'll see tonight in Korean, or at least the key ones, for sure. And so please check that out and go to our Korean website for the slides. And I guess with that, please welcome me in joining Mike, in welcoming Mike and Maureen.
Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be with you here this evening. As David said, it is going to be a heavy topic, but a really important one. So just before we dive in, I want to say a few words of introduction, and then we'll get into our training. First of all, here is our simple goal for this evening. We have a very simple goal with this training for you. This training is designed to give you, as a responsible adult, as a Christian, as a part of this community, some basic education and basic skills so that you can contribute to both prevention and response as needed in this community and wherever God has you. That's our very simple goal. We're going to have 4 parts to the training, and we're going to take breaks about on the hour, so we'll have 2 breaks for about 10 minutes each. The 4 parts of the training, just so you know what we're going to cover, part 1 is just how do we think about what abuse is? So we'll do some definitions and talk about common dynamics. We'll also talk about what God says about abuse. Part 2, Maureen's going to take us through how do we care well for someone who is a survivor of abuse, and how can we understand trauma that often results from abuse, and when we understand it, how can that empower us to care well for those who've been abused? And then part 3 that Maureen will also take us through is learning some practical skills of how we can recognize concerning behaviors and some tactics that bad actors, someone who may be abusive, might use. And then the last section will just bring it all together and say, how can each of us in, again, this community or wherever God has us, how can we all contribute in positive ways to both prevention and protecting vulnerable people, children, and others? And how can we be prepared to respond in certain situations? So again, working on those practical skills. I just want to say, like David mentioned, the Korean slides and the translation available. We are going to make the English slides and all the slides that you see here tonight available. So there's going to be a lot of information. And I just want to make sure you know, of course, if you're a note taker like me, you just need to take a deep breath because we're going to make all of this information and slides available to you. And we are going to have some interaction, but that will be voluntary. And I just want to say, given the heaviness of the topic, in a room of any size, there are going to be survivors of abuse present statistically. So if you are a survivor of abuse, just know that no one is going to be put on the spot tonight about talking about your personal story. It's important that all survivors feel free to talk about their story when they're ready, when they've chosen someone trusted to share that story with, if they ever are ready. But even if you're not a survivor, I just want to encourage you to think about what you need to do to care well for yourself as we make our way through the evening. So I want to give you some strategies that trauma therapists and counselors know can be effective. So if you just find yourself feeling anxious and need to take a break, please do so. That's not going to bother us one bit. If you just need to stand up and move around and do a little stretching, that's totally fine. You're not going to bother us one bit. We invite you to do that as needed. And then, if you have a drink of like a bottle of water or you get a snack during the break, just having a sip of water and swishing it around your mouth. Trauma therapists know this can act like turning your phone off and back on again. It just kind of helps reset everything. So those are a few simple strategies that you might use. One more I'll mention. Just doing some deep breathing. So if you want to try this now, feel free. Just breathe in deeply and feel the coolness of your breath as you breathe in. And then as you breathe out, feel the warmth of your breath as you breathe out. That can just kind of help us stay calm as we're talking about some hard things. Now that said, there's nothing in this training that's going to be especially graphic or shocking. We don't feel that that's helpful. There's not going to be pictures of children with bruises or anything like that. All right, so let's dive in. We're going to start with this foundational idea. How does the Bible speak to abuse? The Bible says some very powerful things about abuse. The Bible speaks over and over about God's heart for people who are vulnerable and oppressed. And in fact, as you read your Bible, I'm sure you know that there are categories of vulnerable people that God mentions in the Bible over and over. And let's just do a little interaction to start us off now. Can you think of some of the categories that are mentioned often in the Bible of groups of people who are vulnerable? Can you just name some of them? Can you just call them out? Widows, orphans, others? Sorry? Foreigners, absolutely. The poor, people who have disabilities, and there are many others as well. And literally hundreds of times, God calls our attention, and the Psalms and other places talk about that God is a protector of widows. He is a father to the fatherless. God is one who is a stronghold for those who are oppressed. God is a stronghold, a refuge. Think about that image, that God, in God's very character and nature, is a place of safety and protection for someone who has been abused or oppressed in some way. In Psalm 9, it goes on to say that God does not forget the cry of the afflicted, that God hears that cry. And in the Bible, that word is a very specific word connected to abuse, oppression. You find it in passages like when God's people were enslaved in Egypt. They cried out. When a woman was being assaulted, she cried out. That's the kind of cry it's talking about, the cry of oppression, the cry of abuse. And it says that God, that's who God is. God hears that cry. Jesus spoke powerful words very directly about children and their value and their place in his kingdom, in his ministry. Now think about this verse that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. And in a world where famous and powerful people, before Zoom meetings and before private jets, like in the ancient world when Jesus lived, a king might send representatives to another king. And how that king was received said everything in that culture about the respect being shown to the one who sent them. So Jesus uses this powerful idea that everyone knew to talk about receiving children, honoring children, caring for children is a way that we show our great faith in Jesus and ultimately God our Father. Those are profound words of the value of children. Negatively, Jesus spoke powerful words about those who would harm children. Again, many of you will be familiar with this verse about the millstone, right? A millstone was a massive stone used to press olives and get the oil or maybe grind grain. The point is, it's a promise of severe judgment against those who would harm children. Some careful New Testament scholars have pointed out that in this context, Jesus uses that hyperbolic language. I'm sure, again, many of you are familiar with it. If your eye causes you to sin, do what? Gouge it out. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Well, some scholars have pointed out in the culture of Jesus' day, those images, that language, often related to sexuality, the eye of lust, a hand that engages in sexual contact. And the scholars note that Jesus used that language earlier in Matthew's gospel. And guess what he was talking about? He was talking about sexuality. So there's a very strong contextual argument that Jesus here is not just condemning any kind of harm towards children, although I think absolutely Jesus does. Very specifically, likely, Jesus is condemning child sexual abuse very directly. In another passage, Jesus condemned those who had like pastoral authority in that day, the scribes. And he said, "Beware of the ones who devour widows' houses." Now think about this verse for a moment. What is Jesus describing? If we used our modern categories, we might say Jesus is talking about financial abuse or financial exploitation, right? Because it's stealing property. But notice it's not only that. We can also say this is likely a condemnation of what we might call today elder abuse. A lot of widows were elderly in that day, just as in our day. Not all, but many. And so that's a condemnation of elder abuse, very likely. And then notice, who is the one doing this abusive, oppressive, exploitive behavior? It's the pastors of the day. It's the religious leaders. So we would call this in our modern language clergy abuse or pastoral abuse. And then I also want to argue to you that this is spiritual abuse. What is spiritual abuse? Well, notice, the pastors doing this are using their spiritual office, their spiritual access that they have to people in the community, and the trust that they have with the other people in the community. And they're using all of that and weaponizing it to exploit these vulnerable widows. Does that make sense to you? Do you see how that is working? And so it's using spiritual position, spiritual power, spiritual access and trust, and using that to exploit or violate these vulnerable widows. A lot of spiritual abuse goes hand in hand with other forms of abuse, like financial abuse or sexual abuse. So just in the last two verses, the passage from Matthew 18 and Mark 12, likely we have Jesus very directly condemning child abuse, likely child sexual abuse, and then elder abuse, financial abuse, clergy abuse, and spiritual abuse. And his words are very strong. He talks about the condemnation for those who engage in exploiting others. Jesus has very strong, direct words to say about abuse in the Bible. It's not going to be something we focus on in this training. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into great detail about spouse abuse, or what's often called domestic violence or intimate partner violence. But when that is happening in a Christian home, it's often hidden carefully behind closed doors at home. And when the family comes to church, that what is happening behind closed doors is not on display in front of the whole community, of course. But it just is worth saying that in the Bible, God condemns very strongly those who engage in interpersonal violence. This is not the way that God calls us to live as Christians. All right, let's do some basic definitions and prevalence. I've already used the word abuse, but I haven't defined it. So let's define it before we go any further. In church, we say things like, we are all sinners. Amen? Amen. But it's important to say that abuse is not a sin like other sins. It's a particularly egregious, harmful, damaging form of sin. Why is that? Abuse occurs when a person holding power and trust uses that power and trust to exploit or violate a person who is more vulnerable in some way. So abuse is almost always by someone who is known to the person they're harming, they're exploiting. There can be abuse by strangers, that does happen, but the vast majority of all forms of abuse is through people who are known, people who are trusted. And that's the key, right? When we think about why is it so damaging, it's because it's someone who should have been protective, someone who should have served, someone who should have blessed. But instead, there's a deep betrayal. Again, it can be from a parent, a coach, a teacher, a pastor, someone known and trusted, again, usually holding power and trust in the relationship. And abuse can come in really any form we can be human, so it can be financial or emotional, spiritual, physical, sexual, and so forth. Jesus spoke a lot about power. And because power is at the root of at the core of what abuse is, it's important to think about how Jesus spoke about power and called us to use power. When Jesus rose from the dead, do you remember that he said, "All power is given to me. All authority, all power in heaven and on earth is given to me." Which means the power that we hold in our homes, in the church, maybe in our work, in relationships, wherever God calls us. Who does that power belong to? As Christians, we believe that power belongs to Jesus. And that means that the only legitimate use of power of any kind, spiritual power, emotional power, the power of position, any type of power, the only legitimate use of it for Christians is to use it in the way of Jesus for the purposes of Jesus. That's a powerful idea for us to think about. Some basic definitions of different forms of abuse and some basic statistics that I think are helpful. Sexual abuse for children, and these are child abuse statistics, and if you want to go see more about this study that we have the reference here, the CDC's website. You can learn more about this study. It's called the ACE study. And there are many other studies that we have on child abuse statistics. But for sexual abuse of children in the US, it's about 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 men are victimized by sexual abuse before age 18. Now, sexual abuse would be between an adult and a child, or a significantly older child and a younger child. It would be, of course, any kind of sexual contact, sexual penetration, but it can be non-contact acts as well. Exposing yourself to a child, filming a child, changing, taking nude photographs and sharing them, things like that. We have very thorough definitions, by the way, that we have given to your leaders that we use. If you would like to see those, I'm sure David can make those available to you. Physical abuse. Physical abuse is when we have injuries, we injure a child intentionally. And physical abuse is not spanking without injury. That's not considered physical abuse. But it's when there are injuries, and it doesn't always have to involve physical contact. It can be egregious forms of, physically intimidating a child. For example, throwing things at a child and the child is terrified. Even if you miss, it's still considered abusive if the child, again, something egregious like that. And that's about 1 in 4 kids in the US. Emotional abuse is a little bit harder for us to define usually because it can encompass a lot of different specific behaviors. But emotional abuse is when a person holding power and trust, again, it could be a parent, teacher, a coach, a pastor, someone like that holding authority, power and trust in the life of a child, when they use a pattern of controlling and domineering behaviors. So pervasive patterns of shaming, insulting, humiliating, threatening, often what we call bullying behaviors. When that's a constant pattern, that's considered emotionally abusive. The other side of the coin of emotional abuse is emotional neglect. And that is when a child is not told positively, you are safe, you are loved. When children don't hear those positive messages, oh, well done, you did such a good job. That's so beautiful what you made. Children need to hear messages like that and to develop in a healthy way. And then physical neglect, it's about 1 in 10 kids in the US. It's not about poverty when there are just a lack of resources. It's when there are resources, especially in the home or some other caregivers, and those resources, like food, medical care, warm clothing, and so forth, when those are intentionally withheld, that's considered physical neglect. Now, spiritual abuse, I don't have a statistic for you, and it is not a part of the ACE study, but it is usually defined as a form of emotional abuse. It's using spiritual ideas about God, Bible verses, spiritual authority, using those things to often engage in some other form of abuse, like we saw with the pastors who were stealing widows' houses, so to engage in financial abuse, or to engage in sexual abuse. So using God to justify to someone, this is okay, to try to manipulate someone. David had many wives. The pastor tells this woman he's counseling, and God has told me that it is okay for us to engage in this behavior, and someday you will marry me. So a pastor uses that as part of a strategy of manipulation. That's sexual abuse, but it's also spiritual abuse. And when it's just domineering, controlling behaviors, it's connected again to emotional abuse, even if it's not connected to sexual or financial abuse, for example. A couple of other forms impacting adults. So spouse abuse, or what is often called still domestic violence. The newer term is intimate partner violence. The American Medical Association estimates about 1 in 3 women will experience this at some point in her lifetime. Now, sometimes men are also victims of intimate partner violence, but the vast majority of victims are women. Clergy sexual abuse, when a pastor crosses a sexual boundary, certainly with a child that's abusive, or even with an adult under their spiritual authority or care, that's considered an abuse of power. And some experts looking at a wide range of studies conclude that's about 10% of all clergy. So what I'm saying is, are all clergy or a lot of clergy or even most clergy abusive? No. But there is a significant minority who are. And it's not an affair. That's what many churches for years would call a pastor crossing a sexual boundary with an adult in the church. But that's not the correct framing. Or even a general framing like sin is not what we need to use. We need to use the right language, because in that case, the pastor holds so much power. It is an abuse of power when the pastor crosses that sexual boundary and he is responsible. So there's a perpetrator and a victim. And that's really a key distinction in all kinds of abuse. So what we're talking about when we talk about abuse is not two people sinning together. Do you see that? It's not about two people sinning together. It's about one person sinning against another person. One person sinning, one who is being sinned against. A perpetrator and a victim. If we don't understand that, we're going to do a lot of harm in our response, because we're going to shift some of the responsibility away from the perpetrator, and we're going to shift some of the responsibility onto the victim, and this is very damaging. Now, we have a role to play. That's why you're here. We're going to talk through some leadership issues with your leaders tomorrow, and that is so important. And leaders have an important role in preventing abuse, but really it takes all of us as a community to come out of denial and understand how abuse often works, so that if there is something concerning that we notice in the hallway, we are better educated to notice it. And if we can intervene, great. And we'll talk about what that intervention might look like, but you can also find a leader who absolutely will follow up. What we want to do is we want to have clarity about what abuse is and what is expected, because we want to deter a bad actor from trying to certainly be abusive or test a boundary, but we also want to give everyone in the community the skills to recognize something concerning more quickly and to give you empowerment so that you will feel more confident to speak up and get help when that is needed. Again, we're going to talk a lot about that tonight. And that means we have to come into education and leave some old myths behind regarding abuse. There are a lot of myths about abuse that we have believed in churches over the years. And that's in Maureen's church, in my church, and all churches. You know, that it just couldn't happen here or wouldn't happen here. That's just not true. This is something all of us have to deal with. False reports of abuse are not common. The myth is that they are common and happen a lot, and that's just not true. And we're going to talk about some of these others as we go throughout the training. Now, it's important to realize that Jesus not only spoke very direct words against abuse, he also talked about how abuse works. Here he's talking about, and I'm sure many of you know this famous verse, he's talking about one who is a part of the community and who comes in the front door of the church. Now, Jesus did not warn us about the one who walks in the front door and he's talking about a false teacher. Remember in the context, like a false teacher, a false prophet, so he's talking about a leader. Jesus never warned us, beware of a leader who walks in the building and says, "Bring me all your children, I want to gobble them up." Of course not. He didn't have to say that. But he said, beware of one who's like a wolf in sheep's clothing, one who hides who they truly are. All abuse involves power and trust over someone who's vulnerable. And notice Jesus is talking about someone who is known and trusted, who is a part of the community. He's talking about someone who is living a double life. They are using deception and manipulation in the faith community. And notice it's not just deception targeted at a potential victim, be it a child or adult. It's really targeted also, it is, but it's targeted at the whole community. That double life is lived in front of the whole community. These are common abuse dynamics, and most of them are found, a lot of them are found in that verse, just that one verse by Jesus, talking about someone who holds power over someone who's more vulnerable, someone who is known and trusted in the community. Now, a lot of abuse is driven by entitlement thinking, entitlement thinking, like, what does that mean? Entitlement thinking is like, that attitude, I can do what I want, I can take what I want, and I don't care what anyone thinks or says, I'm going to take whatever I want. Jesus mentioned the wolf in sheep's clothing part. That's the deception and manipulation part. And many who abuse will try to isolate and use tactics to maintain secrecy and silence. And those tactics can be a lot of things, but sometimes it's threats and fear, shame, and guilt. Those are all very common. Now, we don't have time tonight, but we are going to build some things into this training that if you wanted to come back, we have some summary slides at various places. We also have a place like this for you to read the story of Tamar. Do you remember the story of Tamar? In 2 Samuel 13. If you read that story, you will see all of those dynamics in that story, because those are common dynamics in most stories of abuse. You'll see that the offender is not a stranger, but someone known and trusted, Amnon, her brother. The abuse happens in a home, that's very common. Amnon has a lot of power. He's a prince, a son of David. He uses deception and manipulation, not just of Tamar, but of David and others in the community. He is entitled. Tamar says, "No, do not do this." And he basically, by his action, says, "I do not care what you're telling me. I'm going to do it anyway." Now, even in the story, if Tamar had frozen and not been able to say a word, that would not have made her any less of a victim. She is not responsible. He is responsible. And this had a devastating impact on her life. So again, I encourage you, after a break, after a week or two, that would be something, if you wanted to go do some reflecting work, that would be good. What's interesting to me as a Christian, when we think about Jesus' words and those common dynamics we see in a biblical story like Tamar, the story of Tamar, those are the exact same dynamics that researchers talk about, researchers who are experts on abuse, that most victims are known, that a lot of abuse occurs in places like the home, just like it did in the case of Tamar. A lot of abuse is perpetrated in isolation. In the story, Amnon works to isolate Tamar. And a lot of it is perpetrated in close proximity to others. And that will impact how we go about prevention. And it's important to know that a lot of abuse is perpetrated against children by other minors. And again, that is important to understand when we think about prevention. So our policies and the things we're doing and procedures will have to account for that. Many victims never disclose. And as I mentioned, false reports of abuse are rare. I'm not going to read this quote, but Victor Veith is one of the leading researchers or experts on child abuse research in the whole country. And he happens to be a wonderful Christian. He happens to be on our board. And he says that these instances, statistically, are very rare. All right. With such a heavy topic, I just want to have a little check-in before Maureen comes up. Actually, Maureen, come on up. And while she does, again, maybe just take a deep breath. Feel the coolness of the air as you breathe in, and then the warmth of the air as you breathe out. And just think that despite this hard reality, Jesus has not left us alone in the church. He has spoken to these issues, and most of all, he came himself. He did not leave us alone in this world, full of sin, suffering, abuse, oppression, but he came to us, and ultimately, he will make everything new.
Now? Sure. So now you can hear me? Yes? All right. Hold on. Okay, so let me try to do this. Okay. Okay, so for this segment of the training, we're going to talk a little bit about the impact of abuse and what are some common impacts of abuse. Now, everyone's an individual, so not everyone will have all the common impacts of abuse, but there are some things that, as I've said again, they're common. So we'll talk about some of that. And this is going to give us a basic understanding of abuse and trauma and the impact of it and how God calls us to care practically for victims and survivors who are in the midst of dealing with these impacts. So, got this. Abuse impacts the whole person. It's a deep wound to all a person's, well, personhood. And that's how God designed us. He designed us holistically in his image. And that means that if you harm one part of us, you harm all parts of us. So it's not a surface wound. It's very deep, and it's an attack on someone's personhood. And what studies tell us is that the majority of children who've been sexually abused will be moderately to severely symptomatic at some point in their lives. Now, some common impacts of abuse could be physical. Children could have difficulty eating, sleeping, focusing, and those are things that are common to all humanity. But for those who've been abused and experienced trauma, it's going to be far more interruptive in their development and in how they're trying to live out their lives. Another category of impact would be spiritual. So a lot of people who, especially children who've experienced sexual abuse, have difficulty trusting God, trusting other people, trusting themselves and their own perceptions. They have difficulty with faith, and they just have difficulty choosing to be vulnerable with somebody because that's what got them into trouble in the first place in their thinking. So emotional impacts can include being angry, being grieved, being very, very confused, feeling betrayed, feeling lonely, feeling different. And so those are just some of the common impacts. Now, hold on, come on. Wait, I got it. All right. Common spiritual impacts. When abuse occurs by clergy, or within a Christian home, or in a church, or in some kind of religious environment or context, the spiritual injuries to that victim are far greater than if it's just abuse that is outside the context of anything involving God or spirituality. Okay, so with this understanding, let's begin to talk a little bit about ways that God calls us to care for survivors on an interpersonal level. Later, we're going to discuss how do you respond and in different situations, like how do you report. But right now, we're going to focus specifically on interpersonal support and some practical things that victims and survivors need. Okay? Since the survivor or victim may decide at any point to trust any one of us, we need to be prepared to receive them telling us about their experience, and we should have some preparation for that. So that's kind of what we're going to focus on a little now. Scripture calls us to expose deeds of evil. We know this with Paul in Ephesians. And the Bible also uses the language of binding up wounds as God does. And like God, we are called to do the same, to love and to care for others by binding up their wounds. We see this in Psalm 147, Ezekiel 34, Luke 10, and lots of other places in Scripture. So now, a lot of you may know the Good Samaritan story. So I'll give you a little refresher, and we'll talk about that for a bit. So basically, there's a man who is questioning Jesus, and he's trying to kind of justify himself, and he asks Jesus, who is my neighbor? And Jesus responds by telling a story, and the story answers two questions. And one of them is obviously who is my neighbor that I'm called to love? And what does it mean to love my neighbor? And so when Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan, he's answering those two questions. And what's interesting is, if you remember the story, Jesus talks about a man who's walking on the road to Jericho, and he gets assaulted, and he's robbed and beaten and left for dead. And a number of people go by, and they're all religious people, and they're too busy or they have things going on. And so they don't stop to help the man. But the Samaritan, who would have been somebody that the Jews in Israel at the time would have been prejudiced against, he's the one who stops to help the Jewish man who's been assaulted. And so what's really, really profound, and Mike pointed this out to me when I first started working for Grace, was when someone asked Jesus, who's my neighbor? Who am I called to love? How am I called to love them? The story God or Jesus tells is a story of someone who's been abused and assaulted. And so just think about that for a minute. Who are we called to love? Well, obviously, each other. But in specific, Jesus mentions this: the person who has suffered, the person who's been abused, betrayed, and assaulted. And how are we called to love them? Well, to take care of them. And that's what the Good Samaritan does. He binds up his wounds and brings him to an inn, and then at his own cost says to the innkeeper, take care of him. Now, different churches and different families and different people have different resources, and so it'll depend on the type of resources you have. However, God is calling us to the best of our ability to love our neighbors in that kind of way. Speaking about abuse, learning about abuse like you're doing tonight, sitting with victims and survivors and making space for them to share their stories with you, feeling the emotions that they express that are strong and difficult, practicing and modeling behaviors that will help you to create a safer community, a safer space. All these things are really, really difficult. But we have to overcome our discomfort so that we can understand and help victims. Right. Mm-hmm. For far too long and for far too often, churches have enabled a culture of silence, disbelief, and blame, and that re-traumatizes victims. So there's this idea attributed to Martin Luther. He said something along the lines of, birds are going to fly over my head and I can't stop them, but I can stop them from building a nest in my hair. And basically the meaning that we usually interpret that as is, you can have a thought pop into your head, but you don't have to dwell on that thought. You don't have to let it build a nest in there and take up residence, right? So it's the same thing with if a victim sits down with you and tries to tell you their story. Some of us, because we didn't, we're all coming here tonight with our background. We didn't just come here out of a vacuum. So some of us might have thoughts like some of these pop into our head when a victim is disclosing abuse to us or seeking support from us. Now, it's fine to think these things. There's no shame in that. We're all human. No one's perfect. We're all learning to be better. But you want to be able to restrain yourself from saying them out loud because these are harmful things. Someone who's already been betrayed and abused and victimized, when they have the courage to open up and tell you, what they need is support and belief, not any kind of questioning or any kind of statement that's going to make them feel, harmed. Okay? The other thing that's really important to remember is that no matter what a victim does, what she's wearing, who she texts, who texted who first, where she went, nothing ever justifies somebody assaulting or abusing another person. Nothing. That's full stop. So there is never any justification for someone to assault or to abuse someone else. If only I'd done this instead of that. Why did I text him? Is there something wrong with me that makes abusers target me? Why did he pick me? Why did he choose me to abuse? Survivors typically already struggle with questions like this, questions that have to do with guilt and shame and blame. And this, of course, is understandable. Plus, abusers and offenders have a tendency to, as they're grooming and abusing their victims, placing a lot of shame and blame on them. So what we need to remember is that survivors need to be kind to themselves, and we need to do everything that we can not to add anything to this struggle and to this burden. Children and adults who disclose abuse need belief and support. We all need to be ready to enter into their story like Jesus would. You want to try to look concerned. You want to try to pay attention to how your face is expressing what you're thinking, what your emotions are. You want to communicate support and comfort, not just with your words, definitely with your words, but not only with your words. You also want to be able to do it with your body, and that can take some practice for a lot of us. Now, this is one of the difficult truths that I've realized, and that can be very, very heartbreaking for many, many Christians. If someone you care about comes to you and tells you that they've been abused, you can't fix it. You just can't. That's not how God designed healing to take place. It's a long and difficult healing path. That's how God designed it. And it's very rough to know that we cannot fix it, but we can do other things. We can make space for them, we can listen to them, we can be supportive, we can be present. Also be aware, and this usually people do this with the best intentions, because so often Bible verses comfort us. We want to give Bible verses or Christian platitudes to someone who's been victimized, but in that moment, that's not the place for that. They're not going to find that helpful, and it could be more harmful. So again, instead, you want to do something like give some key responses like these. Something really simple, but effective and supportive. They're just basic expressions of care. Trauma therapists suggest that creating space for a survivor to express any strong emotions and validating these emotions is very, very important for their healing. Suppressing the emotions that are caused by abuse and betrayal do more harm than good. It impedes the healing process. So you want to encourage victims and survivors in their own time and space to be able to open up and express these difficult emotions. But that means that for us, we need to be able to sit with them while they express those difficult emotions. Now, this is a very biblical idea. Biblical psalms of lament are deep expressions of grief, of confusion, anger, betrayal. Paul tells us to weep with those who weep. And again, that's very uncomfortable. But it's one of the things that's going to be a catalyst for that person's healing. So we need to, again, become comfortable with discomfort and, be supportive. I think I went too far? No? All right. So you want to listen well, validate strong emotions, offer support. So, survivors need belief and support. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Interpersonally, that's what we're responsible for as the community that they're in, their Christian community. We need to be prepared like Jesus to enter into their stories, to sit with them in their stories. Remember, Jesus doesn't ever minimize pain. He enters into our suffering and our pain. And that's it. We have break now, right? All right, so you guys have 10 minutes? Yep.
So, I'll just come up here. Make sure I'm on the video. Just to reemphasize one point that Maureen said that is so important. All of us have the ability to say the words, "I am so sorry." And, your pastors, your elders, your spiritual leaders, those are not always the people who are chosen by a survivor, as Maureen said, to share their story. So it's important that we're ready to say those words. And those simple words, "I am so sorry," or "that should not have happened to you," that can just mean so much. So that is something that, to me, is so encouraging, that God has given us the ability to help a survivor on a path of healing at the beginning by saying those words. So that's so important. All right, we're going to take our first break. It's 10 minutes. So look at your phone, your watch, and we'll see you back here in 10 minutes.